With the International Court of Justice having made its provisional finding on the issue of Gaza, it seems more imperative than ever that we understand the origins of the brutal carnage and destruction that we witnessed over recent months. Where were these poisonous seeds of conflict cultivated? And where and why did they germinate in the Eastern Mediterranean with such long and horrific consequences? We need the facts. We actually need the facts to make informed decisions, to confirm our analysis perhaps, or like Holocaust survivor and well-known, internationally known psychologist Dr. Gabor Mate, make us change our minds.
You need some historical context. Now, look, I used to be a Zionist. As you mentioned, I'm a Holocaust survivor. Zionism was very important for me as a salvation of the Jewish people, until I found out that the state was founded based on the extirpation, the expulsion, and multiple massacres of the local population. And that's not historically controversial. So I'm taking a longer view of this. And I'm saying that the present situation cannot be understood without looking at the historical context, and nor can we move forward if the present occupation and the suppression of the Palestinians continue.
Obviously, despite continuing claims to the contrary, did not all begin on October the 7th last year. That was a symptom, yet another symptom, as was the 17-year blockade of Gaza, other violent clashes over the years, the 1993 Oslo Accords, the myth of what has been dubbed the Phoney War of 1948, and the Nakba. The Nakba was, of course, the catastrophic expulsion of some 700,000 Palestinians from their homes and into what has now looked like permanent exile, and involved the massacres that Dr. Mate mentioned. So, what is the historical context? Where and when did this horror have its origins? There are many tributaries that fed into what has become a gory mess in the East Mediterranean. Ideological seeds of racism and supremacy cultivated in Europe had spread to the Palestinian region of the Ottoman Empire by the start of the last century. Most carried by a minority of Zionist zealots, such as a man named Arthur Ruppin, who even regarded the Sephardic Jews, those are the so-called Arab Jews, as inferior to the Ashkenazi, the European migrants. Ruppin's views, however, were not Jewish views or even his own. They were widely shared in Europe, especially among the ruling elites, who tended to subscribe to the pseudoscientific theory of eugenics, introduced to Britain, incidentally, and introduced globally by a man called Francis Galton, who ironically was the cousin of Charles Darwin, he of Origin of the Species, which showed that all humanity really originates from the same stem. No, these ideas were that people of the world were divided into races, with, in the British case, Anglo-Saxons, white Anglo-Saxons at the top, black Africans at the bottom. And in between, we have various peoples as they were seen, the Celts, the Irish, who were seen as brutish, quite honestly, by a man called Knox, the anatomist, the Scottish anatomist, and of course, the Gypsies, Jews and Arabs in between. And within each race, it was said, there were those who were born to rule and the majority who were born to be ruled. This, it was claimed, was the natural order of things. But it was just a simplistic rationalization when you think about it, to justify colonialism, which then was at its height, and social class prejudice. These supremacist seeds sprouted and bloomed horribly little more than 100 years ago in another time of mass slaughter and destruction when, as now, the latest available weapons of war were being deployed. That was World War I, so-called Great War. The war, as they said then, to end all wars, a time when carts and cavalry charges had become things of the past. The newest means of organized destruction, of mass murder, were in use. Tanks and aircraft, along with aerial bombardment, with much the same results today as they were then. At that time, Britain and France and their allies, this is World War I, were at war with Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and the vast Ottoman Empire that had for some 600 years governed the region of Arabia, from Constantinople, now Istanbul, across to the Gulf of Aden and including the eastern Mediterranean seaboard, now known as Israel, Palestine. For 7 months, up to January 1916, the British and French imperial forces suffered a terribly costly defeat at Gallipoli, with more than 220,000 casualties. The British in particular, and perhaps this goes back to eugenics, had clearly underestimated the prowess and power of the Turkish Ottoman forces. And it was seen as necessary then to open up another front against the Turkish Empire. Arabia was seen as the answer because, as in Europe and in Africa, and certainly in India, there was the emergence of national feeling, of minorities, of people who'd been persecuted, who'd been oppressed, been exploited, wanting to gain some kind of freedom. Now, while most of the Ottoman population were Muslims, the Arabian tribes tended to regard the Caliph of Mecca, Hussein ibn Ali, he was a direct descendant of the Prophet Muhammad, as the legitimate head of civic and religious affairs for all Muslims. But he and his ancestors before him had for hundreds of years been subservient to the appointed Caliph in Constantinople. And this was widely resented at the time. And so, with nationalism on the rise, the British approached Hussein Ali with the promise that if he could rally the tribes of Arabia behind the British effort, the British allied effort against the Ottomans, he and the people of Arabia would gain their independence when the war was won. It was a classic piece, actually, of imperial deceit, but Hussein agreed. And there is a very graphic filmic representation of what happened on June the 10th, 1916, when I would argue the seeds of conflict began clearly to erupt. Yes, that was the actor Peter O'Toole in the 1962 film Lawrence of Arabia, in which O'Toole played the part of Colonel T.E. Lawrence, who was deeply involved in the rebellion, which started with the derailment, which you've seen, on the Hejaz Railway. Hussein also proclaimed himself at the time King of Hejaz, which is today, actually, the major part of that is today Saudi Arabia. And there's another story behind that of colonial, imperial deceit, etc. But there were also other agendas at play. Even as the British government was promising independence to Hussein, and the people of Arabia were to get their independence, representatives of the British and French governments, two men called Sykes and Picot, were stitching up a secret deal with the agreement of the Russian Empire and Italy on how they would carve up, to their benefit, the Ottoman Empire once the war was won. A single Arabian kingdom did not, obviously, feature. In Britain at the time, however, there was another agenda also watering the seeds of future conflict. A brilliant émigré chemist and Zionist, Chaim Weizmann, emerged as an extremely adept diplomat and lobbyist who was well versed in the prejudices and bigotry of the British upper classes. He used them to Zionist ends very, very cleverly. As Professor Jonathan Schneer author of the recent book, The Balfour Declaration, notes about Weizmann.
The British-based Zionist who understood this best, who best seized the opportunity that it represented, was, of course, Chaim Weizmann. Weizmann had been born in Russia. He had left Russia to continue his education because, of course, education for Jews in Russia had insuperable obstacles. And so he received his PhD in chemistry in Switzerland. I think he also studied in Germany, actually, but then Switzerland. And he took finally a job at the University of Manchester in England. He was fairly well known in the world Zionist movement in the years before 1914. He was not one of the leaders of British Zionism in the years before World War I. There were 3 or 4 people more prominent than he. But with the war, he very quickly ascended and became, without any question, the leading British-based Zionist. Why? Well, first of all, it turned out that he was a diplomat of genius and could charm the British governing elite. He embarked upon what I call a charm offensive, and it was remarkably successful. He was a genius at teaching the British governing elite the principles of Zionism. He also managed to persuade them, quite against the facts, that all British Jews who counted were Zionists. But there's something more important about him. He was one of a very few who were able to practice a kind of political jujitsu and turn anti-Semitic prejudice to his own advantage and to the advantage of his movement. So, many in the British governing elite had grown up with, shall we say, stereotypical views about Jews. They represented a vast subterranean influence in the world. Yes, Weizmann said to them, we do, right? They thought Jews controlled finance, world finance, which would be very important in the war effort, and especially American finance. Yes, Weizmann said, you're right. They thought Jews were also behind the movement to pull Russia out of the war, but that that they were going to pull Russia out of the war. Weizmann said, yes, if you don't watch out, we'll do that. And so at his very subtle prompting, the British, many, not all, but many in the British governing elite put 2 and 2 together and, to put it baldly, came up with 5. To win the war, they must have Jewish support. To gain Jewish support, they must promise them something all Jews want. Well, Weizmann had taught them, all Jews are Zionists. What do all Zionists want? Palestine.
And this was the origin, of course, of the, I suppose, now notorious Balfour Declaration. It actually came in a chatty little note from Lord Balfour, then the Foreign Minister of Britain, to his fellow peer, Lord of the Realm, Lord Rothschild, a wealthy Jewish banker and Zionist supporter. In this little note, he included a 67-word, that's all, just 67-word declaration, granting in landlordish fashion Palestine as a homeland for the Jews. They should not, however, upset the existing tenants. Now, this we should not forget was at a time when Britain had no ownership or control or any rights whatsoever over Palestine or anywhere in that region. But already the propaganda mills were underway. As far back as 1913, a Zionist-sponsored film, and the Zionists, while they were a relatively small minority of the Jewish communities around the world, were quite influential and very well sponsored. They sponsored a film about the Jews of Palestine. and promoted one of the most pernicious, I think, and enduring myths about the region. It was said to be a land without people for a people without land. A classic example was included in this 1913 film and is dealt with here by historian Michel Campos.
Well, it all depends on where the photographer aims the camera, right? I mean, you have the famous image of shareholders for Ahuzat Bait, which becomes Tel Aviv in 1905, standing on the sand dunes. Well, the photographer was positioned to their south, photographing them to the north, in which there were, in fact, sand dunes. Had he turned 180 degrees to photograph himself behind them, they would have seen the vast orchard groves of Christian and Muslim landowners. They would have seen Jaffa, an important, bustling port city with a very vibrant local, regional, and international economy.
Also in 1913, there were other films made that illustrate the old city of Jerusalem of that time. Historian Issam Nasser explains.
Jerusalem was not as we know it today. First partitioned into Palestinian East and Israeli West, and then Muslim Quarter, Christian Quarter. These names came later on. The physical place was very mixed. At the end of the day, Jews, Christians, and Muslims intermingled, lived together in the various neighborhoods and quarters of the old city.
So the seeds of conflict were well planted, watered, and sustained by lies, deceit, and supremacist ideas that had grown strong in Europe when, in 1920, the League of Nations awarded Palestine as a mandated territory, as was planned, to Britain. This was also a time which saw the emergence, a little bit later, but over the next decades, of fascism in Italy, Spain, and Portugal, and the rise of the National Socialist variant in Germany, where there was a significant degree, now often denied, of collaboration throughout the 1930s between the Nazis and the minority Zionist movement, aimed at moving Jews out of Germany and into Palestine. Now, many Jews, aware of the dangers of Nazism, did flee Germany, but they were turned away by the countries they tried to get into, such as the United States and even South Africa, all of which added to the Zionist argument of nation and homeland. And Jews in Europe, like the Sinti, Roma, well, Sinti they were known as in Germany, Roma elsewhere, but widely known as Gypsies, and some other groups were regarded by the self-proclaimed Aryan race in Germany as Untermenschen, less than human. A final solution for them was extinction, mass murder. More than half of the perhaps 10 million people, men, women, and children, who perished because of their race, or because of being Untermenschen, were Jews. And this gave even more strength to the Zionist argument that Jews constituted a nation and deserved a national home. And of course, Britain had promised Palestine. In the wake of World War II, well-organized Zionist militias, because there'd been a considerable aliyah, these were the people who'd been organized from the Hashomer, the thugs who basically were the first irregular military group who dressed as Arabian tribesmen, rode horses, and protected Jewish settlements. These militias undertook a great terrorist campaign. In fact, admitted they were terrorists, even blew up the King David Hotel. So eventually, by 1948, the British had taken the issue of Palestine to the United Nations, the successor to the League of Nations. And the United Nations came up with a partition agreement. They would have Palestinian areas and what they called Jewish areas, in fact, effectively Zionist areas. This then led, by 1948, not only to the Nakba, when the Haganah, which was effectively the putative Israeli army, and two irregular groups, the Irgun and what were known widely as the Stern Gang, who carried out some of the more brutal and nasty bits of work of ethnic cleansing of local inhabitants as they tried to expand the Zionist state. And then came the great myth, the David and Goliath struggle by brave little Israel against the massed armies of the Arab states. It's best summed up, I think, by General John Glubb, known as Glubb Pasha, who was in fact in charge of the Transjordanian army. In fact, the only army among the Arab states that was in any sense properly organized, well-equipped, and well-trained. He called it the Phoney War, because the Zionists not only outnumbered and outgunned their opponents, the only force on the Arab side was Transjordan, and Transjordan chose not to join the fight, having done a deal whereby the government of Transjordan, headed by one of the relatives, incidentally, of the original Caliph of Mecca, Hussein Ali, took over the Palestinian West Bank. That was their payment for not fighting in the Great War of 1948. And here is where we start the modern catastrophe of Israel and Palestine, of Gaza, and the ongoing catastrophe of the settlements, illegal settlements, the fact that Israel has rejected all the United Nations decisions to ask them to stop, and the ongoing, seeds of catastrophe that have now erupted, not of conflict, seeds of conflict, but seeds of catastrophe that have erupted. And I think that this is well summed up using an example of Greek mythology by Professor Jonathan Schneer.
Some of you will know the Greek myth. Cadmus slew the dragon. Athena told him to plant the dragon's teeth. From the ground rose up soldiers. I think that during World War I, Britain sowed dragon's teeth in the Middle East. Their fruit was resentment, suspicion, recrimination, hatred. Eventually, new soldiers rose up from the ground, and as we all know, they are rising still. Thank you very much.